Just before 6 o'clock on the morning of June 4th, 1989, a yacht known as the Rose Noel was peacefully bobbing somewhere off the coast of New Zealand. Below deck, 4 men were asleep after what had been a long, exhausting day. The weather had been ugly the afternoon before with strong winds and heavy seas, but they fought hard to maintain control of the vessel. The sails were by then secured and a sea anchor had been deployed to keep the boat steady and in place. Outside, the wind had spent most of the night howling, climbing toward hurricane force before easing off. At one point, gusts were even over 69 miles or 111 kilometers per hour, but by then, things had calmed enough for the men to fall asleep. At 6 a.m. though, the quiet of the early morning gradually started to change. A deep roaring sound, like something massive was approaching, suddenly woke the 4 men up and shook them from their bunks. The roar kept growing, reaching deafening levels before the inevitable occurred. This would be the beginning of one of the most prolonged and grueling ordeals in maritime history. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The sound was coming from an approaching rogue wave that had risen in excess of 60 feet or 18 meters. And as the men scrambled for something to grab onto, the Rose Noel went nearly vertical. For a split second, it felt as though the boat was being held in place. Then everything tipped. The wave picked the yacht up and flipped it clean over. Inside the cabin, loose gear went flying and everything went dark as water surged in from every direction. A moment later, the Rose Noel was upside down in the ocean. The collision threw the men into the walls, and as the wave carried past the boat and things began to calm again, the 4 crewmen aboard were disoriented. The floor had become the ceiling, and the ceiling was now submerged, and ocean water filled every available space inside the crew's quarters. This was stopped only by a large air pocket that had formed. Somehow the Rose Noel didn't sink. It was still floating on the surface of the ocean, and the 4 men inside suddenly found themselves trapped just a few days into a voyage that was supposed to be nothing more than a winter holiday. Now, the Rose Noel was a trimaran, which is a type of sailing vessel built around a central hull with 2 smaller protruding hulls attached by crossbeams. This ship design provides speed and stability at the same time. It was lighter than traditional single-hull boats and faster in open water. Even in less than perfect conditions, trimarans can cover serious distances quickly and handle rough seas better than most other ships. At 41 feet or 12.5 meters long, the Rose Noel wasn't enormous, but it was far from fragile. John Glennie, one of the men aboard, had actually built the yacht himself, drawing on years of experience sailing in the South Pacific. He used modern materials and construction techniques that were relatively cutting edge at the time. Named after a former girlfriend of John's, he believed that the yacht could handle heavy weather, long distances, and treacherous conditions. And considering that the Rose Noel was still above water, albeit upside down, that confidence was well placed. Trimarans behave differently from single-hull boats, especially in rough seas. They don't roll as easily, but when they do lose stability, it can happen fast and without much warning. At the same time though, a breaking wave hitting at the wrong angle or a sudden loss of control can overwhelm any ship, regardless of design. But the Rose Noel proved strong enough to at least survive being capsized. Interestingly, the 4 men trapped inside the Rose Noel hadn't known each other that well when they left New Zealand. In fact, they barely knew each other at all. John, at 48 years old, was the captain of the group. He had spent years sailing the southern seas and understood the risks that came with long offshore passages. He was confident in his skills and his ship, and he was comfortable making decisions at sea. Phil Hoffman, meanwhile, was different. At 41, he had less seafaring experience, but more appetite for life. His wife, Karen, always said that Phil wasn't the type to see a glass half full. Instead, he wanted his cup to be overflowing, and that showed itself in an infectious energy that pulled people toward him. They married young and built their lives around family and staying active. And by the time of the voyage, which now stranded Phil somewhere in the middle of the ocean, they had 4 children and were living aboard their own boat sailing around New Zealand. It was while docked in Picton, New Zealand, that Phil's opportunity to join John's voyage came along. Phil's boat was tied up behind the Rose Noel, which provided the occasion to strike up a chat with John, who was planning a winter trip to Tonga and needed an extra hand. Phil was a builder by trade and he was used to physical work, so he didn't hesitate to agree to come along. Even after having triple bypass heart surgery, Phil continued to chase thrills, and the voyage to Tonga felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. Rick Hellriegel and Jim Nalepka, meanwhile, joined the crew in a much more casual way. Both actually answered an advertisement posted at a local backpackers hostel that John had placed, looking for crew members willing to make the run north. Rick was 31 and Jim, an American, was 38. Neither had deep experience sailing offshore and neither had any long-standing connection to the others. They were there because the timing worked and the offer sounded good. When the crew was formed, they each brought something different to the table. John had the experience, Phil had the enthusiasm, and Rick and Jim had willingness. When they all stepped aboard the Rose Noel to begin the trip to Tonga, they weren't a tight-knit crew, and that would eventually come to show itself in ugly ways. The Rose Noel left Picton on June 1st, 1989 and set a northern course toward the open Pacific Ocean. The crew planned to sail from New Zealand to Tonga, spend a few weeks enjoying a winter break in warmer weather, and then make their way back. The entire trip was expected to last around 3 weeks, and for the first day and a half, everything went exactly as planned. The weather cooperated and the seas were manageable for that time of the year. From the get-go, the trimaran moved well and covered distance quickly, just as John expected it would. He assigned watch schedules and they'd make small talk and eat meals together between making adjustments to the ship. Once the ship cleared the New Zealand coast, the ocean opened up fast as shipping lanes thinned and aircraft flying overhead became more and more rare. The route they were taking wasn't one where boats passed regularly, especially in the winter. This meant that if something went wrong, there would be no nearby harbor to get to and no easy way to call for assistance. By just the latter half of the second day, things began to shift in subtle ways. The wind came in harder from the north, and the Rose Noel felt strained as it took on the headwind. The ride became more noticeable as the waves grew steeper and less predictable, but everything was still manageable for someone of John's extensive experience. Unfortunately, that's when the wind strengthened, causing the seas to build even more in response. The yacht was still on course, but steering it became hard work that required constant physical effort. John stayed on the wheel himself, but eventually it became clear that he couldn't even do it alone anymore. So rather than continue to fight the conditions, John made the decision to slow the Rose Noel down and let the storm pass. He then deployed a sea anchor, which is a device designed to drag through the water and keep the bow pointed into the waves. Used properly, it could stabilize a ship in bad weather and prevent it from being knocked sideways, which would reduce the strain on both the boat and crew. Once the anchor was out, the Rose Noel slowly fell into place, meeting the sea head-on. With the situation under control, the men could finally get some rest. So soaked and exhausted, they retired below deck and tried to sleep. Sometime during the night, the wind died down, which should have been good news, but as it dropped, the seas only intensified. Without the force of the wind flattening the waves, they grew taller and more forceful. Even worse, unseen by the crew, the sea anchor fouled itself at some point in the night, meaning the rope got twisted or tangled. This caused the ship to ever so slightly start to turn itself sideways, exposing its long side to the coming waves. Below deck, the men had no way of knowing this as the movement was almost imperceptible. They slept through these subtle changes in motion, setting the stage for what was about to happen. In due time, the 4 men aboard the Rose Noel would find themselves in a situation none of them were prepared to handle. Again, as the wave that flipped the yacht upside down continued past the Rose Noel, chaos erupted below deck. In the darkness of the cabin, as the roar of the wave dissipated, they could only hear the sounds of their screams and rushing water. They checked on each other by voice, calling out until all 4 of them were heard. Surprisingly, everyone responded, and no one turned out to be injured during the capsize. Once the immediate shock wore off, they began to realize how much trouble they were in. Still floating, but flooded with cold winter ocean water, the Rose Noel had only the air pocket for the men to survive in. Had the cabin filled completely, the men would have been trapped inside with no chance of finding a way out, so they were lucky in that sense, but things weren't really that much better. In the commotion of it all, John knew that if they didn't find a way to get themselves above the waterline, it was only a matter of time before exhaustion or hypothermia caught up with them. So moving their way carefully around as they felt their way through the darkness, they retreated to a small aft cabin beneath the cockpit. It was an area that was cramped even under normal conditions, but that's where most of the air was. They then dragged whatever they could find into the space, including mattresses, drawers, loose panels, and furniture. Wedging each of the items on top of the next, they constructed a platform with a mattress at the top that would keep them out of the frigid water. When it was complete, they all climbed onto it. The mattress itself was the only dry place it could be, and it was barely 4.5 feet wide. There was no room to stretch out and no way to turn over without forcing others to shift with you. If one person moved, everybody had to move, but they made the best of it as they pressed together and shivered to keep warm. After a chance to catch their breath, the next priority became escape. They were unsure how long the air pocket would remain a safe environment, and if the cabin continued to flood anymore, they would need a way out. So using whatever tools they could reach, the men hacked a hole through the hull just big enough to crawl through. This opening became their only connection to the outside world, and with it now cut, they turned their attention to signaling for help. John activated the emergency radio beacon and was convinced that a rescue was now just a matter of time. In his mind, the worst of their ordeal was now over. They had done everything they could to give themselves a chance at surviving, and now they just had to wait and let the beacon do its work. Settling back onto the mattress though, none of them knew they were drifting into one of the loneliest stretches of ocean on the planet. For days, the Rose-Noelle drifted upside down and unnoticed, and the reason had everything to do with where they were. The capsize occurred roughly 140 miles off the east coast of New Zealand, near the far edge of normal shipping routes. This is a part of the Pacific Ocean that's normally avoided. Commercial vessels had little reason to pass through, and fishing boats stayed closer to the shore. Even air traffic overhead was sparse at best. It's what sailors sometimes called a marine desert. Worse still, the emergency beacon, which the men believed would be their lifeline, had limits even John didn't fully understand. Its signal could only be picked up within a certain range, and at their position, there were no aircraft monitoring the right frequencies nearby. So for 8 days, the beacon transmitted their location, but no one was listening. Then it stopped working entirely. The men didn't notice this right away. The beacon didn't have an alarm or a warning light to tell them that their best hope of rescue had just faded, so they continued to wait, rationing their energy and looking through the makeshift escape hatch when the weather allowed. As the days dragged on, though, optimism began to fray. The realization came all at once that if no one had arrived by then, they weren't coming at all. Whatever safety net the beacon was supposed to provide had failed, either because no one heard it or because they were simply too far away from anyone who could respond. Rescue wasn't happening at all, and that shift in thinking changed everything aboard the upturned Rose-Noelle. From that moment on, every decision had to be made with the assumption that the 4 men were now on their own, adrift in the open ocean with no idea of where they were headed or how long it would take to get there. Once the reality set in that no one was coming, the most immediate problem became obvious. They didn't have nearly enough to live on. Most of the supplies were still down in the submerged parts of the cabin, and getting to them meant diving into cold, dark water and feeling around blind. John took that role on himself, and he periodically braved the cold water in search of food and things to drink. At first, they had survived on emergency rations, which were little more than small portions meant to buy time. But before long, John managed to locate some of the stored food. What he found wasn't necessarily ideal, but it would do. Much of what he recovered consisted of apples and boxes of soggy breakfast cereal. Still, it was food, and that alone made them feel a little bit better. John also managed to salvage a small gas cooker and a barbecue, which would come in handy soon enough. Drinking water was another story, though. The Rose-Noelle had carried about 140 liters of fresh water in onboard tanks. Early on, the men assumed that the supply was secure, but they still rationed it carefully, believing they had weeks before it could become critical to obtain more. What they didn't realize was that the tanks were slowly emptying themselves. Unbeknownst to the men, leaks had drained their most precious resource away day by day, and by the time they understood this was happening, the damage was already done. Freshwater became scarce almost overnight, forcing them into severe rationing. For weeks afterward, their only fluids came from small amounts of soft drinks that John had managed to recover. They literally had just mouthfuls to drink for some time to quench their thirst. But then on their 40th day at sea, something finally broke their way. It rained, and by sheer luck, John had recently finished a makeshift water collection system using split lengths of plastic pipe to catch runoff. When the rain came, it filled their containers faster than they could believe. They were still cold, cramped, and trapped, but they could drink again. They even made tea each morning, and they could hydrate properly instead of counting every portion. It didn't mean they were now safe, but for the first time since the capsize, they weren't in a constant fight to remain hydrated. Interestingly, food and water were only part of the battle the 4 men were facing. The rest of it played out in their interpersonal relationships. As mentioned, the 4 men had started the voyage as virtual strangers, and now they were confined to a space barely large enough for one person to lie down comfortably. Cold, hunger, and fatigue took their toll, and there was nowhere to retreat to and no escape from each other's moods. Tempers flared over things that would have seemed ridiculous under normal circumstances. They'd argue over who got the better spot on the mattress or who could sit closer to the small escape hatch where daylight filtered in from. Arguments even broke out over half a biscuit, and every disagreement seemed to matter because there was so little to go around. At times, the tension between them even turned dark. There were moments when one of the men, who wasn't named in the sources, became a liability in the eyes of the others, which spiraled into thoughts none of them were proud of. More than once, the other three apparently even considered killing him and tossing him overboard. No actions were ever taken, but the presence of the ideas alone said a lot about the mental toll the situation was taking on them. The water catchment system and the weather each played huge roles in how well they began to cope with their situation. During the worst storms, they were sometimes trapped below deck on the mattress together for 4 or 5 days at a time. Those stretches were the hardest as they worried about going down, but they stayed warm by huddling together on the mattress. And over time, the 4 men slowly became a unit. They weren't necessarily friends, and they definitely weren't always comfortable with each other, but they were connected by their shared experience and knew that survival wasn't just about any one person. As the weeks dragged into months, the Rose-Noelle itself began to change. With the boat floating upside down the entire time, marine life slowly took over the hull. Barnacles and mollusks attached themselves to the fiberglass until the trimaran started to resemble a floating reef more than a wreck. This would turn into an unexpected advantage as fish soon followed. At first, sightings were rare, but as the growth in the hull spread, larger fish began to come around. Kingfish circled the hull, offering the men the opportunity to start fishing, which became their most important task. They improvised gear and learned quickly how to spear the passing fish as they swam by. It was dangerous work on a slick, unstable surface like the upturned hull, but their success changed everything. They suddenly had fresh food and a use for the gas cooker and barbecue that John had salvaged. By the second and third months, fishing became a constant activity, and when conditions were right, they hauled in plenty with each catch. They even joked that they were eating better than people back at home, which was a far cry from their daily 2 tablespoons of uncooked rice they rationed out in the first few weeks. Their relationship with the environment shifted as well, as they learned when to stay inside and when it was safe to venture out. John in particular relied on mental discipline to get him through the worst of it. During storms, when they were trapped below for days at a time, he escaped by going somewhere else entirely. He imagined himself at home, warm and dry in his bed, and this brought him comfort. Throughout the ordeal, John also kept a logbook. In the early days, his entries were long and detailed, but by day 116, he was reduced to writing out a few lines and asking if this was enough and if he could go home then. It was half a joke and half a plea, but without any of them realizing it, he was about to get an answer. For most of the 4 months they spent adrift, the men had no real sense of where they were. There were no charts to consult and no instruments to read. The horizon had no landmarks to track, only vast, open ocean as far as any of them could see. And incredibly, based on everything sailors knew about this part of the world, their situation should have ended very differently. They were drifting in the Great Southern Ocean, a region infamous for powerful winds and relentless currents. The latitude they were stuck in was part of what sailors also call the Roaring Forties, where strong westerly winds typically push anything floating in their path steadily eastward. Normally, a disabled vessel in those waters would be carried across thousands of miles of open ocean. If the Rose-Noelle followed the expected pattern, the 4 men should have been swept towards South America, eventually washing up on the coast of Chile, if they survived that long. Instead, though, something unusual happened. The wind of the Roaring Forties didn't behave the way it was supposed to, and rather than driving them east, it gradually shifted and began pushing them back the way they'd came. Day after day, the trimaran drifted in a direction that defied the prevailing currents. It was slow and completely invisible to the men aboard, but over weeks it added up. Storms may have been battering them, and the cold below deck may have been pervasive, but the Rose-Noelle was inching westward toward New Zealand the entire time. Incredibly, on the 118th day of the ordeal, land appeared. After months of nothing but water and sky, they could finally see something solid on the horizon. It was September 30th, 1989, when the Rose-Noelle reached shore, and the approach wasn't exactly gentle. 9-foot or 3-meter waves drove the trimaran hard toward the coast of Great Barrier Island, about 56 miles northeast of Auckland. The closer they got to shore, the more violent the ocean turned as it smashed the remains of the yacht against a rugged shoreline. The fiberglass broke apart from the pounding it took, and what was left of the boat came undone piece by piece. As the wreckage was torn up, they scrambled for shore and dragged themselves out of the water, and somehow all 4 made it safely to land. The location itself felt like a stroke of luck too. They had washed ashore at Little Waterfall Bay, a remote stretch of the island's southeastern coast. Just a short direction in either direction, though, the shoreline rose into rocky cliffs. Had the Rose-Noelle hit there instead, the men likely would have been crushed against the rocks before ever reaching land. They spent their first night ashore in the bush, unsure of where they were or how far help might be. After months of dealing with the constant motion of the sea, firm ground felt strange, but that didn't keep them from sleeping better than they had since their ordeal began. The next day, the men left the shoreline in search of help and came across an empty house. With no one around and no other options, they broke in and did things they hadn't been able to do in 4 months. They washed themselves, shaved, cut their hair, and put on clean clothing they found inside. They cooked a real meal and ate until they were full before collapsing into individual beds and sleeping through the night. The next morning, they approached a neighboring home that had a phone line and called the island's only police officer to report that they were alive. The reaction to this news was immediate disbelief. Word spread quickly that the 4 men thought to be lost at sea had walked out of the bush on Great Barrier Island, and the media clamored to cover their return. The story should have ended right there. 4 men survived months at sea, and against all odds, they walked right back into civilization. Instead, though, that's where the doubts began. Almost immediately, officials and journalists started asking questions that didn't have easy and apparent answers. The biggest problem was the location. Again, based on what the men described, the Rose-Noelle had capsized 140 miles off the east coast of New Zealand. From there, the prevailing winds and currents should have carried the wreck steadily east out into the Pacific, yet the boat washed ashore on the opposite side of the North Island. Authorities and experts couldn't make the drift make sense. Adding to the confusion were radio messages. Maritime authorities had records of transmissions believed to have come from the Rose-Noelle days after the crew said the boat capsized. One message placed the yacht near the Kermadec Islands, more than 500 miles northeast of Auckland, far from where the men claimed to have been when they overturned. If those messages really came from the Rose-Noelle, then something about the crew's timeline was wrong. Either the boat hadn't capsized when they said it had, or someone else had sent the transmissions. Investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that another vessel was responsible for them, but that explanation didn't satisfy everyone involved. There were other points of skepticism too. Some sailors questioned how the 4 men could survive a stormy southern winter at sea without developing serious pressure sores or ulcers, which were common among those adrift for long periods. Others wondered how a boat drifting for 4 months could pass anywhere near shipping lanes without being spotted. As the media attention intensified, rumors followed, and a few commentators even suggested that the story was a hoax. Others floated the idea that the men had been involved in drug trafficking and staged the survival tale to cover their tracks. For the 4 men who had just endured the ordeal of their lives, it was jarring. One day they were simply trying to stay alive, and the next they were being asked to defend the truth of their own survival. Thankfully, the investigation into what really happened was thorough. Authorities examined the remains of the Rose-Noelle and found heavy marine growth on the hull, which only could have accumulated over an extended period upturned at sea. That evidence alone made it clear that the boat had been drifting for months, the way the men claimed. As for the strange drift pattern, John argued that the charts didn't always tell the full story. Currents in the region were weaker than many assumed, and persistent winds were more than capable of pushing a light, overturned trimaran in unexpected directions. In the end, there was no proof of deception found. The official conclusion may have been hard for some to accept, but the men were telling the truth. In the aftermath of it all, as you might imagine, life hardly snapped right back into place for the survivors of the Rose-Noelle upon their return. Physically, the 4 men were in better shape than many people expected. Some of them had lost as much as 40 pounds during their ordeal, but they had endured 4 months in cold, violent seas without catastrophic injury. John would later say that what they missed most during that time was movement, and that the lack of exercise had taken a deeper toll than hunger ever did. Mentally, the effects were harder to measure. Throughout the ordeal, John never doubted that they would survive. Survival to him had always felt inevitable, but things were not the same for the others. Thoughts of his family carried Phil throughout the worst days. He wondered constantly whether or not he would see his children again, and came to believe that he simply had too much to lose to give up. That belief kept him going when food was scarce and the days seemed endless. Karen, meanwhile, for her part, waiting back in New Zealand, never fully accepted that Phil was gone. While others urged her to face reality and consider organizing a memorial service, she held on to hope that Phil was still alive. And despite, or possibly because of, all they went through together, Rick and Jim said they never wanted to see John again, and John felt the same way toward them. Whatever bond they had formed during the months they spent adrift didn't survive their return to land. In all, the Rose-Noelle drifted nearly 1,900 total miles, or 3,000 kilometers, and the crew survived 118 days upside down at sea before being blown ashore. It remains one of the longest documented survival stories of its kind. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.